Big T Steak Corner.
This is my first computer. This computer was actually my dad's computer back in 1999 or 2000, but then he upgraded to an Athlon XP about 2 or 3 years later and he gave me this. Over the years, a lot of components have failed on this computer, so I've been doing my best to keep it going. Basically, all that's original right now is the motherboard and the processor. Unfortunately, many years ago, the original 20GB Maxtor hard drive croaked, so I've since replaced it with a 30GB Quantum Fireball AS. Right now, it has a copy of Windows 98 on it, and it has a lot of the old files from the old hard drive, but I wasn't able to get everything off of it, unfortunately. When my dad upgraded, he stole the Sound Blaster, so I was stuck with onboard audio. A couple of years ago, I decided to change that when I found a Yamaha DSGX sound card. I also added more USB ports too. Originally, it had 256 megabytes of memory, and when we got Windows XP, it was upgraded to 512. Now, unfortunately, both the DIMMs are dead, so I have some replacement modules here, still at 512. The processor is a very bruised, but still working, 1.2 GHz AMD Duron Thunderbird core. And that processor is the topic of today's video. The AMD Duron was AMD's response to the Intel Celeron, and also actually some of the entry-level Pentium 3s as well. What's interesting about the Duron is that it's a very high clock processor, well, at least for its time, and they had lots of overclocking potential as well, but they were crippled with their level 2 cache. This particular model only has 64 kilobytes of level 2 cache, compared to its Athlon brothers, which have triple the L2 cache, 256 kilobytes. Now, I've always found the performance of this AMD Duron to be rather lackluster, so much so that I even managed to get a 200 MHz stable overclock and I noticed no difference. So, I started wondering, is the 64 kilobytes of level 2 cache our problem? So I set out and I got my hands on an 850 MHz AMD Athlon, also based on the same Thunderbird core, with, of course, 256 kilobytes of level 2 cache. I'm hoping I can overclock it to at least 1 GHz, and I would be really interested in seeing if a 1 GHz Athlon can outperform a 1.4 GHz AMD Duron. So join me, let's do some testing. So in order to get this test right, I decided to install Windows 2000 on some random hard drive I had. I chose Windows 2000 because not only is it a lot more stable, the drivers are also a lot more well written for Windows 2000 as well. On top of this, I went with an ATI FireGL X3 256 GPU for doing video game testing. Of course, it's an AGP 8X GPU, so it will be a little bit limited since it's on AGP 4X, but it shouldn't be a huge deal. We basically want these processors to go to town, and I know that the FireGL is a very powerful GPU. So the very first test we're going to be doing is a test that was recommended to me by a fan and a close friend of mine, the 7-zip benchmark test. Now, I'm not going to lie, I don't exactly know what these numbers mean, but it lets us compare things, and that's pretty cool. We're going to take things slowly with Serious Sam the first encounter. It looks like we were basically at an average of 60 FPS. Of course, we got a couple dips into the high 50s, but overall very, very playable, runs very great. 2003's Devastation is quite CPU dependent, and you can see at the intro level at the Gracious HQ, we're getting dips into the low 20s sometimes. It's not unplayable, but it's really fluctuating all over the place. Now we crank up the difficulty about 5 steps with Unreal Tournament 2003 at max settings. I actually forgot to mention, I am running everything unless specified at max graphical settings. Anyways, it looks like the game really started to struggle here. We're playing DM compressed, and we would see dips into the low 20s when there was a lot of action going on. So I'm wondering if the new processor will see some gains here. I guess we'll have to find out. Lastly, Need for Speed Underground 1 was something akin to a slideshow. Now, it wasn't always like this, but majority of the time when you were racing in more dense areas, you would see dips into the low 10s. I would say that this game is honestly unplayable on this processor. Well, by now it's pretty obvious that the AMD Duron, while it does a pretty decent job at running titles from its time period, anything a little bit newer, i.e. 2003 games, are just pushing it and it falls flat on its face. You know what? Maybe we can't fault it for that. It is a budget CPU after all. So let's try the higher end mainstream Athlon. Let's see if its triple L2 cache comes and helps it out. So I actually managed to achieve a stable 1003 megahertz overclock on the CPU. I really tried to go for 1.1 gigahertz, but it just wasn't having it, both the motherboard and the CPU. So after some stress testing, finding out that 1 gigahertz is the sweet spot for this CPU, I say we should continue our tests. So if you remember, the AMD Duron scored 957 MIPS, while the AMD Athlon scored 757 MIPS. I'm not sure if the difference of 200 is like a landslide gap, but I don't know, 200 seems pretty big to me. I'm not feeling too good about this now. Studying the Serious Sam footage, we can see that there is no difference at all. It is almost frame per frame identical to the AMD Duron. Devastation sees the exact same performance as the Duron as well. I'm beginning to see a pattern already. So, as you can tell, the results are exactly the same across the board. But why is that? You would think that maybe because the CPU speed was lower or slower, it would maybe perform worse. Well, the issue boils down to a problem that no longer exists but used to exist back in the day. It's the chipset. The chipset is causing our CPU to underperform. I don't really know the technical details about it, but unfortunately this chipset doesn't allow us to take full advantage of our AMD Athlon and AMD Duron processors. So this is why they're both kind of capped at the same performance. I'm also aware that certain little things like fraps and whatnot can cause performance issues, but at the end of the day, what I found out from my research after doing this is that in modern day and age, you probably want to get the processor that has a higher clock speed. Cache isn't such a big problem as it was back in those days. Now, if we were talking about 2000, 2001 when these processors were new, you may have wanted to opt for the Athlon because it had more cache, and CPUs being starved of cache back then was a bit of a problem. But these days, you actually really don't see that big of a performance boost between two identical processors with different cache. If I'm not mistaken, the Thunderbird was the first of AMD's processors to have non-external cache. The cache was on the CPU. So it made accessing the cache extremely quick. So much so that even the lowly little Duron with 64 kilobytes would outperform the previous Athlon with 512 kilobytes of external level 2 cache. So I'm actually wondering as well if both the Thunderbird, AMD Duron, and AMD Athlon, if the difference between 64 and 256 was actually that big since they were both on the CPU and non-external cache. Anyway, this science experiment kind of turned out to be a little bit dull in the end, but I hope you learned something along the way because I most certainly did, and stay tuned for more content.